Anne was born Mary Ann O'Neill on the 24th of March 1946 in Glasgow, Scotland. Very little is known about her life growing up, but at the time of this case, Anne was 44 years of age. She was married to her first husband, Ralph Cockburn, but would inevitably move to England in the 1980s when she began a relationship with a man named Peter Heron. It was on a golfing holiday in 1984 that brought the two together. Peter was 49 at the time and a company director of a haulage firm. He was on a golfing break with friends in the Isle of Bute in Scotland's Firth of Clyde. At the time, he was married to his wife of 20 years, Catherine, to whom he had 3 daughters. He was a company director of the business and it was doing very well for itself. Whilst on this break, Peter had got talking to the then very attractive Anne Cockburn, a resident of the Isle, and also a mother of 3 who had been married to a policeman for 15 years. Anne and Peter hit it off famously after finding out that they had a mutual friend back in Darlington, and they stayed in touch even after going back to their respective partners. With a clear mutual attraction between the pair, Anne visited Darlington to see her friend, and while she was there, looked up Peter. They began an affair, and in 1986, he divorced his wife and married Anne in that same year, and both of them left their spouses and children to set up home together. Peter and Anne married at Yarm Road Methodist Chapel in Darlington, with a luxury reception following at a nearby hall. The wealthy couple then set up home in a beautiful, large, secluded property set off the busy A67 Darlington to Yarm Road, quite near to the village of Middleton St George. Peter Heron worked as a company director for this haulage firm. It was only down the road from the house. Everything seemed to be going great between the pair until the 3rd of August 1990. That day, Peter had gone off to work at the haulage firm as usual, and as the couple were quite affluent and Peter was earning a good wage and did not need to work full-time, but instead had a part-time job helping out as a care assistant at a local care home. That day she wasn't working. Peter had gone off to work, and in the morning she had been out shopping with a friend to buy a birthday present for an 18th party that she was attending that evening. Peter had come home from work. It was customary for him to come home around 1 p.m. lunchtime, and Anne was home by then. Anne had prepared Peter his usual, which was soup and a sandwich, and they chatted and ate lunch. After dinner around 2 p.m, Peter started his drive back to work while Anne stood in the kitchen and washed up the pots from lunch. That beautiful day, the temperature was in the 90s. Anne had decided to take advantage of the beautiful sunshiny weather. It was the hottest day of the year, and Anne had decided to sunbathe in the grounds of her beautiful house. So, with bikini on and a nice drink, she laid in the gardens on a sun lounger. She was midway through a book about the paranormal. The book was The Ghosts of Flight 401, and she had her collie dog by her side. She was laid down on the sun lounger trying to catch rays. Anne was unhappy living in Darlington and often missed her children back in Scotland. This beautiful big house was described as a conspicuous building, which was clearly visible from the busy main road. Anne was known to have felt frightened of the isolation of the house. She was said to have felt wary of being alone in the property. Peter left to go to work at 2 p.m, and at 2:30 there was a phone call. It was her friend Sheila. Sheila also worked at the care home. Sheila had called Anne to organise where they were going to meet that night, as they were both going to the 18th birthday party together, and apparently Anne sounded happy and cheerful. Peter's daughter had driven past around 3 p.m. and saw the sun lounger positioned by the front door and thought to herself, "I know what you've been doing, Anne." She'd been forced to move to the front of the house to sunbathe nearer the road because the tractor nearby had been blowing grass towards the back garden. This was the last sighting of Anne alive. When Peter Heron returned back to his house at 6 p.m, her radio was still on, and her book and cigarettes were laid out. The dog was also outside, and the house front door was wide open. Anne's body was found in the living room of the house. She was lying on the floor in a pool of blood and had a stab wound to the side of her neck. Her bikini bottoms had been removed, which indicated that it may have been a sexually motivated killing. The weapon used had been something like a Stanley knife or a razor blade. The murder weapon was missing from the scene and was never found. Police arrived and made a thorough examination of the scene and grounds of the house. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, and there were no signs of any ransacking or searching through the property, as you would if you didn't live there or know what she had there. Indeed, the house was still impeccably tidy. There was no signs of forced entry to the house. The outdoors showed no signs of disturbance, although Anne's book and a pair of shoes were found under a tree about 15 metres away from the sun lounger. The post-mortem report concluded that an estimated time of death for Anne was around 5 p.m, and that the cause of death was due to blood loss resulting in the shock and then her death. There was no sign of sexual assault to Anne or any signs of her being beaten or involved in a struggle, but her bikini bottoms had been removed. But what was the motive? And it wasn't immediately apparent. Within the first few months, the intensive police investigation had seen more than 7,000 people spoken to, over 4,000 witness statements taken, and over 100,000 man-hours spent on hunting for Anne's killer. With everyone spoken to who knew Anne, and they all echoed the same, that she was attractive, well-liked and popular with those who knew her. She wasn't found to have any enemies or people wishing her harm. She had no disputes with anybody that they knew of, nor was any evidence found to suggest that she may have been involved in any illegal activity or having any affairs. Anne and Peter were described as a happy couple who were popular and well liked. Peter made a public appeal. He was very upset, appealing for information to the identity of Anne's murderer to come forward, and offered a £5,000 reward. As both the husband of the victim and the person who found her body, police scrutinised his alibi from the afternoon of the murder. That afternoon, he had left to go back to work around 2 p.m. to attend a meeting with a potential client in the nearby village of Cleveland Bridge until around 4:30 p.m. when apparently it was over. He then headed back to the office. He had left the office about 5 p.m. and headed home. Several witnesses saw a blue car parked at Anne Heron's house and then speeding down the driveway from the property around the time she was murdered. In the Crime Watch appeal, which aired in October 1990, investigators stated that it was possibly a blue Astra. At 5:05, a taxi driver and two women in another car who were passing the property saw a blue car speeding down the driveway and away from the house, travelling so fast that the taxi driver did not know whether it would stop or pull out in front of him. The car pulled out immediately behind him but accelerated and overtook before racing across the nearby roundabout and driving down Yarm Road into Darlington. Several other people also reported seeing this particular car parked at the house and then speeding down the drive, and investigators believed that it was the same vehicle. Several other witnesses gave a similar description of the male driver as being aged between 35 and 45, with a suntan complexion and short dark hair. When Anne Heron's murder was reconstructed, the multiple sightings of this blue car were described as obviously the most interesting of the sightings. Although it was said to have possibly been an Astra, it was also noted that the car could have been a Mazda, Toyota or Vauxhall Cavalier. Police tracked down homeowners of 3,500 blue cars, but the car in question was never found or identified, and despite several witnesses saying they'd seen the driver, a photo fit was never produced of the man, with the Durham police later stating that the description of both the vehicle and the person driving did differ from person to person. The police found no evidence of robbery or sexual assault. Police believed that Anne was murdered around 5 and was discovered around 6. Her body was found in the living room, but it suggested that it was placed there. 1 week after the murder, it was discovered that her 55-year-old husband, Peter, was having an affair at the time with a 32-year-old barmaid at the local spa club, leading some to suspect that he may have had a motive to kill Anne. Statistically, most murder victims know their killers. 62% of those murdered in England and Wales in 1988 had been murdered by someone they knew. And statistics also showed that 37% of women murdered in the UK are killed by their husband, boyfriend, or lover. And only 13% of women murdered in England and Wales in 1988 were murdered by strangers. Peter had left a meeting at Cleveland Bridge at 4 p.m. and was said to have driven back to his office, although the village of Crofton-on-Tees and Middleton St George. Detectives questioned this route because going via Croft was not the most direct or logical route to take from Cleveland Bridge, which is only 400 metres from his home. Police felt that Peter had a missing amount of time that he could not account for between 4 and 5:50 p.m, the time period in which the murder had occurred. In October 1994, the police, Peter Heron and a newspaper received a series of strange letters from someone claiming to be the killer. The letter to the newspaper, the Northern Echo, began, "Hello editor, it's me, Anne Heron's killer," and ended, "You readers will have plenty to talk about, signed, the killer." Forensic tests were carried out on the letters in an attempt to establish who the author was, and handwriting samples were taken for comparison with the suspects in the case. 2 years after the murder, in 1992, Peter Heron remarried. He did publicly defend himself to the press when questioned why he had remarried so quickly. Police were adamant that scientific advances could eventually lead to the identification of Anne's killer, and in early 2005, Durham police brought in one of the country's foremost forensic scientists, so a series of laboratory tests could be conducted. There were blood traces and fingerprints found on some of the 1,500 items originally taken from the crime scene, and they were forensically examined. This led to an arrest in November that year of Anne's husband, Peter Heron. His DNA was found on samples taken from his wife's body at the time of the murder. Apparently, semen was found on samples taken from the back of Anne Heron's throat. CPS agreed to charge him after he was interviewed a number of times. However, the case against him was subsequently dropped due to a lack of evidence. The decision was made after additional expert opinions were obtained on the scientific evidence presented, leading to a barrister advising the CPS that the case should be discontinued. Durham police insisted that Peter Heron's release would not stop them from going back and re-interviewing him. Investigators subsequently announced their plans to re-examine key evidence, and in 2007, fresh forensic tests were conducted on what police described as the crucial samples from the crime scene. Investigators stated that advances in technology would allow some samples taken from the scene to be re-examined, and for the first time using super-sensitive technology. Now, Peter Heron claimed that after finishing this meeting at Cleveland Bridge sometime after 4 p.m, between 4 and 4:30 p.m, he had travelled back to his office in Middleton St George by quite a circular route through the village of Crofton-on-Tees, instead of simply driving there on the A67, which passes his home. Police were suspicious of his claim that he took this unusual route, as the murder of Anne occurred around the time he said he was completing his journey. Peter Heron has long claimed that he was at work at the time of the killing. However, the police feel that they cannot fully account for his movements between 4 and 5:50, the time period in which the murder occurred, and he has given conflicting accounts over the years of the exact timings of his movements that day. He had certainly been in a meeting with clients at Cleveland Bridge at some point that afternoon, but while he previously claimed that the meeting had started at 3:15, his daughter testified that the meeting began at 3:45 and only lasted half an hour. Mr. Heron had originally said that it started at 3:15 after being told by police that a former employee of his had reported seeing him driving erratically at high speeds towards the murder house at 3:15 p.m. He said in 2016 that the meeting, which was taking place only 400 metres from his house, ended at approximately 4:30 p.m. Mr. Heron also had been positively identified driving his white car around a roundabout 2 miles from his home between 3:50 and 3:55 p.m. when he was supposedly in the meeting with clients. In total, 3 separate witnesses reported during this time seeing a car which they thought may have been Mr. Heron's travelling towards his home at excessive speeds, although each gave a different description of the car. Mr. Heron said that after the meeting ended, he took an extremely long route back to his office through the village of Croft, meaning that he would not have driven past his home during the time period that Anne was murdered. And when police asked him why he did this long route, he said that he had gone to see a woman he was having an affair with. In 2022, in the Channel 5 documentary on the murder, Durham police revealed that Peter Heron, along with other various unnamed individuals, were suspects in the case. Then, many years later, a retired shop worker came forward and offered information about a sales rep who'd visited the card shop she worked at in Newton Aycliffe many years before. He had claimed that he was the killer of Anne Heron. The woman known only as Sylvia claimed that the rep had gone into the back to talk to the manageress about a possible order. They were gone for about 10 minutes and he came out first. He looked at me and smiled, although it was more of a smirk than a smile. The manageress came behind and she was physically shaking. She was frightened. She said, "You'll never believe what he told me. He told me that he'd killed Anne Heron, but he was never going to get caught because he was moving to Australia." I don't know why he said it, although the manageress looked a lot like Anne Heron. She wouldn't go to the police, saying it was probably just playing silly beggars. But it was only years later, because the description was exactly the same as the man who'd been seen speeding off in the car from the house. Peter Heron stresses he didn't have a problem with being interrogated. His finances checked, his life history checked, his personal life raked over and made public. That had all happened 15 years previously. And he understood why Durham police had to do it. "They destroyed my life," he said. "People don't believe me, but I was furious when the case collapsed. I wanted it to all come out, for me to be found not guilty by my peers and everyone who knows me. Instead, people think I'm the man who got away with it." Despite the arrest of Peter Heron back in 2005, the case against him was later dropped due to a lack of evidence, and to this day, the killer of Anne Heron remains a mystery. There must be somebody out there who knows something about what happened that day. You might think that the information you have is insignificant, but trust me, even the smallest detail could be a game changer in this case. It might be just the missing puzzle piece that they were looking for. They're appealing for anybody who might remember that day, seen it on the news and at the time remembered something about it, but didn't come forward. Please contact, if you're in the UK, on 101 or 0800 555 111.